I'm Dr. Christian Moro, Assistant Professor of Medicine and Biomedical Sciences at Bond University, and today we're looking into Physiology 101. Brad and I will be talking about everything from muscle fatigue to contractions to some trends in research, looking into the human brain, as well as a bit about blood and how it works. So going through a bit of the human body and some current trends in research and how it's so interesting to us.
And the winner is...
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome back, or welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by the Gold Coast Marathon and Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll bring you a range of episodes from Coaches' Corners to Interest Editions, Expert Editions, and Featured Performers. And on today's episode, we keep the Expert Edition theme going, and I bring you a recent conversation that I had with Dr. Christian Moro on all things physiology and anatomy. Dr. Christian Moro is the Assistant Professor of Biomedical Sciences at Bond University on the Gold Coast. Dr. Moro's teaching pedigree and his enthusiasm for his subjects are second to none. In fact, Christian was recently awarded the Australian Award for Teaching Excellence amongst all of his University Australia peers. That's right, he received the highest honour amongst all Australian university lecturers. Dr. Moro is super passionate about his topics, and on today's conversation, we explore all things muscle fatigue, what causes it, the plasticity of the brain, optimal performance and the limits, and so much more. This really is a very fun and, of course, highly informative episode featuring Dr. Christian Moro, Assistant Professor, Biomedical Science from Bond University. Let's jump straight in. This is a real treat. Joining me today here at the practice, Pogo Physio, is Assistant Professor, Biomedical Program Medicine at Bond University, Dr. Christian Moro, who you've just returned from Canberra, where you picked up the Australian Award for Teaching Excellence, which is actually the highest award for university teaching in the nation. So firstly, welcome, and secondly, congratulations.
Thanks, Brad. It was unexpected, to say the least. But no, it was lovely, and it was a nice trip down to Canberra. It's beautiful down there. So it's nice to see, actually, in university education there's been a big focus on research, and we're all researchers, but it is nice as well to have these opportunities for teaching to be recognised. So I love the award program. I think it's fantastic and look forward to seeing how it continues. So it was an honour.
Well, one that's very fitting. Christian, the theme of today is physiology of the body, and we could go many different ways with this. What I think would be very interesting to start with is, what's one thing that you're fascinated with that you're learning lots about at the moment?
See, this is a problem because it's the whole body. So physiology and anatomy do work together. So anatomy being the structure, the names of the muscles and how they insert and where they are, whereas physiology being the function. So how do muscles work at the gross, so that the bits you can see, as well as the molecular side and the microscopic side. And look, at the moment, there's a lot of interest in muscle contraction. Exercise research is picking up. There's a huge amount of research coming out of the physiotherapy group as well. And more than ever, it seems, the young physios are coming out and getting right into research. So there's a heap in exercise. There's a lot of work as well, and a big paradigm shift, we call it, into our understanding of the brain and how that works. There's a lot of work looking into alternative uses for modern medications, so a lot of pharmacology research. So it's a very fascinating area, but it's not... The thing is, in science and in research and in physiology, we're learning so much more every day about the human body. You'd think we'd know it by now, but there are still cells in the blood that we argue what they do and where they come from. There are cells in the tissue that we've been studying for 60 years plus that we still don't really know what they do. So it's a fascinating area. It's good because it keeps us employed for a long period of time, and it'll continue going, but we're far from understanding the human body and how it works.
Sitting at the top of the human body, the central nervous system, is the human brain. And before we threw to recording today, we were very briefly talking about the brain and some of the things that have you focused on it at the moment. This show, we always say, is themed around helping the listener to perform at their physical best. So, with that in mind, Christian, can you take us through a few of the things that you think are fascinating about the human brain?
Well, look, this is one thing that's quite interesting because the human brain is very unique and it's different to other animals. And for example, so we have our body is relatively small compared to gorillas or primates or other ones, but our brain is relatively big. It's not the biggest brain. We have about 1.5 kilogram brain capacity. Elephant has 5 kilograms. Whale can be up to 9 kilograms. So we're not the biggest brain, but we do have this very large cerebral cortex. So the outside of our brain is called the cerebrum. The big sort of dome area, and there's this layer of what we call grey matter. It's this mass of neurons, and about 16 billion neurons are crammed into that top layer, and that's actually the bit that makes us largely human. We divide it into different lobes, where the frontal part of the brain gives us our human characteristics, our drive, motivation, consideration of others, understanding and conscience of what's good and evil, and so our human characteristics comes from the very front. But the thing is that our brain is not just, okay, it's not the biggest. However, compared to our body size, it's relatively demanding. It's very demanding of our energy. So primates have got larger bodies but smaller brains, which means when they eat, they have to feed these large bodies and not as large of a brain. We actually find that about a quarter of our energy intake per day goes into the human brain. Now, this is big. If we consume 2,000 calories a day, 500 calories will end up, kilocalories will end up in the brain. But 25%, will end up in the human brain, which is very, very difficult to feed. And so the only way that we can do that as the only species to put a quarter of our intake into our brain is by cooking our food. By cooking food, humans are able to pre-digest what we eat. We're able to put energy in and time and fire or heat and energy into that food, break it down to a way that when we eat it, it gets absorbed very rapidly. And that's the only way that we can feed our brain. And if we go into a raw food diet, we lose weight because we're having to put energy into digesting that food. And so we can't eat the same diet that a dog or a primate or other animals are solely because our brain is so demanding. 2% of our body's mass and 25% of our body's energy. The cool thing about it is that the brains in the past were thought of as that's it. Your brain is as it is. It doesn't change, it doesn't move. Whereas now this new field of neuroplasticity has come in, and this simply means that our brain can shape and change and we can get, even the shape can be changed by what we do. So for example, London taxi drivers, an area called the hippocampus. As they study for this big London exam where they have to learn all the spatial awareness of the London city, as they study for that, the hippocampus enlarges. In fact, you can see you can even predict now whether or not someone's going to pass the exam by how much enlarged the hippocampus has been or how much they've been studying. We could technically, as you learn a language, scan your brain and have a look at it later on and say you haven't been studying enough. Your brain hasn't changed enough. The shape of the brain changes. And this is where this new field, you would notice it in apps coming through, brain training, brain activities, working out your brain. And it's a whole new field. And we're not really there yet in understanding how to comprehend that, the fact that our actions can change the shape and the structure of our brain, the prevalence and percentage of grey matter in different areas. And it's very new. It's interesting as well, the more that we learn about this, the more we can do certain things. There was a great study a few years ago where they were looking at the motivational areas, and we've got a thing now called the functional MRI machine where you can actually come and see the brain activity. You can think of certain things and see which parts of the brain light up. And it means then that if you're lacking motivation, for example, you can put on the machine, you can think all these different thoughts and work out which thought actually gives you the most motivation. One funny study, one of the researchers thought about ziplining, and she found that, thinking about ziplining didn't really light up those motivational areas. And when she had one statement, which I think was, turn the thermometer up to hot, for some reason that line of words lit up the motivational area. But the cool thing now is she can go away and say, hey, I've now got a phrase and a thought that gives me motivation. And will there be a time at university where our students come in and say, I'm having trouble studying? All right, pop on the machine. Let's see what thoughts and what actions can get you back into the drive of things. It's this weird process of brain hacking. The other thing then is if we have injuries, if you have an injury to the back of your brain where your eyesight comes from, maybe doing fast-paced sort of FPS computer games or very high visual activities can regrow that area. So we're treating the brain like a muscle, not just a thing. Alternatively, then, does this mean that if young kids are exposed to heavy violence or other things online, does that then mean that their brain might shape around that? And so we're still not quite sure the understanding of this or how we handle it. But this paradigm shift in thought of how we think and how we shape our brain is very different. The number one activity you can do, just if you're interested in changing the shape of your brain, is juggling. Juggle regularly, and it's one thing that'll give an obvious, visible difference to the shape of your brain. It's very small, but it's there, and you can tell. So,
and just to be clear, the shape of the brain, we're not talking about having the brain that we'd all visualise as being the relatively round structure. We're not talking about turning that into a triangle. You're talking more about the shape being the mapping of which bits are which in the cortex. Is that right?
You can see it, but we're talking about the percentage of grey matter in a certain area. Yeah. So a bit more sort of microscopic-ish, accessible. But it's changing, which is fascinating.
And the word being, the term which I know has been used through my working life as a physiotherapist is the neuroplasticity of the brain, the ability for the brain to change, morph, reconfigure, if you like. But it takes given stimuli to do that. So it sounds like at the science level, Christian, there's a whole lot of continuing development there and interesting experiments being done. And from a teaching point of view, obviously that's a big part of your teaching world, bringing this to the students' attention in the biomedical and medical schools there at the university. In terms of performance, what role do you feel? I've always said that physical outputs, be it a technical sport, Cirque du Soleil, say you just mentioned juggling, through to running a marathon full speed, sitting on that just below that anaerobic threshold, which takes an incredible amount of concentration. What's your thoughts on performance in the brain?
So we don't know that changing the shape of your brain makes you better at that activity. We assume it, of course, but it's hard to get a control of someone who didn't do it and someone who did. We do know that the younger the brain, the developing brain is far more neuroplastic. It's far easier to shape. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't shape it as an elderly person. You absolutely can, and we're looking at that, but it's much easier to shape things, which means, does that mean that the earlier you can start having positive thoughts? Like for exercise, it's very much that, running long distance is a mental activity in some cases. If you prepare your brain and prepare for that, and maybe we teach younger kids at school that mental side of physical activity, could that benefit them in the long run? And it seems like it could. It's very hard to just switch on and say, I'm now going to use my brain for this activity or this thought process. Whereas we're now thinking, well, if you've got to exercise the brain, perhaps starting earlier is the way to go. No actual real evidence there, but it's a good thought and it's something that we're looking into. So the earlier you can start having positive activities and positive thoughts and doing pursuits that you like to do, the easier it will be for your brain to change its shape, which may end up causing benefits in the long term. But we're not inhibited from it. So that's where we're at then. So if an aging person has this issue, should we try neuroplasticity? And we are, and it is working. So it's just harder. But we know it's harder to get into different activities and different thought processes and even different sports the older you are. So there's a lot more evidence linking to that. The earlier you start, the easier it is. Whereas we didn't really have that in the past as much.
Christian, before we move off the brain to something that will interest every athlete out there or physical performer, and that's muscles, and the role that they play and how they work, any interesting wow facts about the human brain?
I just think the fact that that it takes so much energy, that having that cooking our food and getting that extra energy in humans, having this incredible system where we're always hungry and our brain always takes that energy is incredible. So it's an interesting thing, but it's something that very much watch this space. It's hard. We can't test the brain like we do other tissue because you can't remove it from the body. You can't put a needle into it and test electricity. You can put things above it over the skull and these EEG machines, but it's very much a secondary assessment. The newest thought is perhaps stem cell therapy, getting some stem cells and growing a real human brain from stem cells, and then we can test that all we want. Ethically, what's going on, we're not sure what happens with that, but it's very much the hardest tissue to assess and test, because the minute it's out of the body, it's not working anymore. So how do we assess it? And a lot of our knowledge of the brain, like I said before, that the frontal region has our human characteristics, we get that from people who have brain injuries or stroke in the brain. So we see a lot of people with a stroke in that area causing that deficiency. Therefore, we now know that area does the following. So it's very much just secondary knowledge, but we're learning more about it.
Muscles, Christian. So we've got this big brain, 2% of the mass, taking 25% of our energy. Muscles. Can you put us in the ballpark around what drives muscle contraction at a physiological level? And then what happens as we're out there exercising to fatigue?
So there's two things that we need for any muscle contraction. Calcium as the trigger for contraction, and then ATP as the power for contraction. And it's actually the first semester physiology when we do actin, myosin, cross-bridge cycling. So there's actually little proteins that sort of ratchet along each other and shorten the muscles. But our muscles, our skeletal muscles, work very much as levers. It's where they're connected that makes the important part. So, for example, our bicep can only contract in one direction, and as it contracts, it pulls up our arm. Whereas our tricep then is paired, which can contract in the other direction. So we tend to have our skeletal muscles. It's beautiful, skeletal muscle under the microscope. It very much is aligned absolutely perfectly to where it needs to be. It's exactly laid out in these long fibers. It can be up to 20 centimeters long sometimes, or plus these long muscle cells or muscle fibers that are all arranged perfectly longitudinally, regular sort of striated patterns. It's stunning to look at because it's such a perfect form of the body aligning itself to maximize that potential. Every single muscle fiber has to get a nervous impulse from the brain. So there's a nerve, part of your brain is connected to, through your nervous system, every single muscle fiber in your body in regards to skeletal muscle. And that's fascinating. So as you're growing, not only are you growing more muscles, but your brain is also connecting to each of them. And your brain learns, well, when I move that signal pathway, it moves the arm. When I move that signal pathway, it moves the foot. So one thing that we're still learning as well is, should you lift heavy or lift light and do better reps? And there's a lot of arguments about that. People fit in both ways. And so the actual exercise physiology of how to develop muscles does seem to be a little bit mixed with genetics, with a bit of the unknown, with what works for each person. And that's still a big cause of fun arguments in the gyms of how to best exercise and the best activity. One thing we've been looking at quite recently as well is muscle fatigue. So let's separate this from psychological fatigue or exhaustion. So muscle fatigue, by definition, is the physiological inability to contract. So if I open and close my hand over and over and over again, if you just open and close your hand, at a certain point, there'll be a time when it just stops. You physically cannot contract that muscle anymore. The muscle isn't damaged. The muscle will come back in a little bit and recover. So what's actually happening in the muscles which causes it to be unable to contract? Now, in the past, we thought, well, ATP is there and being used up in every contraction, so depletion of ATP. Look, ATP definitely depletes, but if we do a biopsy of heavily fatigued muscle, there still is quite a lot of ATP in there. The body's always making new ATP, which is our source of energy. So it doesn't seem like ATP depletion is the reason that our muscle would completely fatigue and freeze up and be unable to contract. The next thing is buildup of wastes, buildup of lactic acids or other wastes and acidic products. Now, same again, even heavily fatigued muscles, yes, there is waste buildup, but even then the pH is relatively constant, which means your body's buffering those wastes quite well. So it doesn't seem then like ATP or the buildup of waste is the cause of that inability to contract. And so then we have to have a look at what you're saying before, the pathway between the brain and the muscle. Now, there's a lot going on here. So there's an action potential nerve all the way down the brain, all the way down the somatic system, so in your spinal cord. Then it comes out of your central nervous system and straight to that muscle. So there's this direct link between your brain and the muscle through the neurons. And there's a lot going on there. We have to have sodium rushing into the system, potassium rushes out. So these action potentials occur because of these ions, sodium, potassium. Every time your nerve fires off, it has to reset itself. Now, nervous tissue actually is only about 10% of nerves. The rest of it are supporting cells which help that nerve process occur. They help the nerves to regenerate itself. They help the nerves to anchor and get to the right spots. It helps the nerves to recover that potassium and sodium as it gets lost. Then once you get to the muscle, there's a few things that occur. The muscle cell membrane actually acts just like a nerve. It acts just like an axon of a nerve. So the brain will send the signal to come across these receptors. So a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine is released, and it binds to receptors on the muscle cell membrane, and that actually starts basically a nerve action potential down the muscle. So your muscle membrane has the same kind of electrical activity as a nerve does. And that muscle cell has electrical activity go all the way along it and then all the way down inside it. And when it releases this massive calcium. So there's a lot going on in every contraction. So for the brain cell, the muscle to contract, it takes a couple of milliseconds for that message to get across, to get that electrical depolarization down the membrane, down deep into the muscle, calcium released, and then this ratcheting starting to occur inside these little proteins, which then shorten the muscle. So where in this pathway then could fatigue be occurring? And that's something interesting. So there's a few things. There's calcium, which gets flooded into the area and then brought up, but perhaps constant contractions, calcium's flooding in, being brought in, flooding in, coming back, flooding in, coming back. Perhaps that calcium system's occurring or damaging what's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, the store of calcium. The other option is then that depolarization across the membrane. So we have sodium and potassium at play. Every contraction, every little brain stimulus, tick, 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 goes along that muscle. So these ions are becoming imbalanced. So it seems like there's so much going on in there. There's a lot of scope for constant contractions to cause this inability to contract through the pathway between the brain to the muscle, but then more likely the muscle down itself and into that release of calcium. So yeah, this is sort of where we get this link between what is fatigue, and it's probably a combination of, depletion of ATP and buildup of waste, but also what we call that disruption of the signaling pathways that cause a muscle to contract, which is probably calcium, potassium, or sodium in there.
And so does that throw up the question? You mentioned brain hacks, Christian, around, hacking neuroplasticity, if you like, with apps and things as an example. Are there any hacks to stop that physiological muscle fatigue, not the psychological fatigue, but any hacks that you think are interesting to share?
Well, all the brain does in any muscle contraction is send a little spark, tick, at a certain interval. It's the frequency of the stimulation from the brain which causes a lot of that, how we get power. The reason, for example, if my bicep picks up a pencil, my brain will go tick, 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 and just tell that muscle little signals, tick, 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 to contract at that velocity or that force. All right. If I have to pick up something heavier, my brain will go tick, 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 and send a faster frequency of signal to that muscle. So the thing is, nerves can only be an all or nothing response. The only connection my brain to my muscle has is a single pathway, which is a yes or no contraction. So the frequency matters a lot. The brain sends a frequency down to that muscle, and usually what it does is it sends a frequency where the muscle has little contractions and then can relax for a couple of milliseconds, then contract again, then relax for a millisecond, to give each muscle fiber a chance to relax between contractions. And it might send out asynchronous contractions. So the one muscle fiber will contract, well, the next door muscle fiber will relax, and then vice versa. So we get this smooth contraction of our muscles as it builds up. So the brain, it's not so much what the brain is. The brain just learns where to send the signal and what frequency to send the signal. And we get that wrong sometimes. You kind of pick up a bottle of water and it's heavier than you think and you lift it too fast, or you have something that you lift too slow, and you kind of learn in real time. You learn how heavy things are and your brain learns how to control that muscle. One of the things then is, if fatigue is this imbalance of ions as our brain is sending ticks down constantly, as our muscles get bigger, we don't need high frequency ticks to lift objects. If I'm very relatively weak and I'm lifting a 10 kilogram weight, I'm going to need pretty max contraction for that. So my brain's going to be sending high frequency contractions down there to lift that weight. The stronger you get, the easier that weight is to lift. The less impulses you need from your brain because you've got bigger muscle fibers in. So each muscle fiber can do more work. So this is sort of one of the reasons why getting bigger delays fatigue. It actually means there are less cycles from the brain required to lift the same size weight. We also then have higher stores of ATP. We have a more water content. We have a larger muscle to negate some of that buildup of waste as well. But the idea is that getting larger means our brain needs to send less signals to lift the same weight as if we were smaller. Now, we look as well as, do our muscle fibers, do they grow? So there's hypertrophy or hyperplasia. Do we simply, as we get bigger, do we grow more muscle fibers, or do the muscle fibers get bigger? And the thing is, because every single muscle fiber needs that stimulus from the brain, and if it doesn't get a nervous impulse, it won't contract. So every muscle fiber receives this connection from the nerve all the way down to that muscle fiber. Is I was going to grow a second extra muscle fiber, I've then also got to grow a whole new nerve pathway. I've then got to tell the brain there's a new muscle fiber connected. So it's far easier for our body to undergo hypertrophy, to make these muscle cells larger. Just simply grow them, because you think I can just grow it quite easily. If I have to make another one, I've got to reconnect it to the brain as well. And there's a lot of wiring going on there. It doesn't mean that we can't. I mean, we start from an embryo. We grow our spinal cord, we grow our muscles, we grow everything, we connect it all together. But later in life, it seems easier for our body just to simply enlarge these cells, add more nuclei to the fiber, make it get bigger. And so it looks like in most cases it's so much easier for the body to make larger muscle fibers, which then gives us that more strength as well. We'll have a good mix in, for example, our bicep of very small fibers and very medium fibers and very large fibers. Our brain will always start with the small fibers, so it connects to them first, and then it will activate the medium fibers, and then it will activate the larger fibers. It does mean then that if I'm lifting a light weight, I'm only activating maybe the medium fibers up to in the brain, which means a lot of my muscle are just simply there for the ride. The minute you go a bit higher or a larger, heavier weight, you're now activating the small, the medium, and the large muscle fibers in your muscle. So you're getting that complete contraction. So it's not that the brain will activate large or small, it always activates the small and the medium, then the larger one. So lifting heavy does activate every fiber in your bicep, which makes sense because the body wants to put everything into it. There's a heavy weight to be lifted, let's use all the fibers and get that contraction going.
What's fascinating there is also that sequencing of how it happens. It's not just contract, relax. There's a whole lot more at play, which I remember going through my university studies, Christian, and some of the wow facts about physiology. It's just astonishing. You use that phrase. It's beautiful to look at skeletal muscle at a cellular level. It's really quite outstanding. In terms of anything,
I'll just say from that. I mean, in your fingers, you can do really fine sewing movements, and you can draw a picture. But you can also, if you're rock climbing, hold your whole body up by one or two fingers. The muscle system is beautiful. You can do everything from very small finite movements to hold a whole human being up. So yeah, I find it fascinating, especially in the fingers and in the muscles and in the biceps, the range of motions and activities that your body can do, from very finite small movement to very heavy sort of lifting movements with the same muscle.
Yeah, it's the same architecture, right? I recall one of the science facts that stuck with me right through my physio career to date, Christian, is around the strength, or the tensile strength, I guess you'd call it, of collagen, and that it's 10,000 times stronger than steel per fibril of collagen.
Yes.
And yet that's the building blocks of so much of our musculoskeletal system, and I've always just thought that's just absolutely incredible. Christian, moving on to, unless there's anything else to
I've
add
got
on the
one
muscle.
last thing to talk about, and this is super mouse. So there's this gene, this PEPCK, PEPCK-C, and this is mildly expressed in humans, but it's a fantastic experiment where PEPCK, just to make it general, it usually generates glucose from fatty acids. So it actually gets some of the waste products of our muscle and reconverts it back into energy. And what they've done in a lab is they've increased the expression of PEPCK, this one gene, in a mouse. And they've created this mouse which is relatively resistant to fatigue. So now I've got a mouse that can, humans have a model which can convert glucose into fatty acids, into glucose, into energy. So as we generate waste, we convert it back into usable energy. And it means that this mouse now can run for many kilometers at max speed without getting tired at all. It can do other exercises for hours and hours and hours and hours. It doesn't build up waste. It doesn't build up lactic acid. It eats twice as much food as control mice, never puts on weight, is generally more active in the cage. It has a lot more sort of reproductive active moments, and it stays reproductive actively for longer, so it has more offspring or potential for more offspring. There's more mitochondria in the muscle. It lives longer. So by reducing muscle fatigue in a rodent, we get this super mouse that just does everything better. And so it's like, well, how much is fatigue holding us back as humans? Could you sign up for a study where you overexpress Pepsi K? And we had the technology to do that in sort of babies, but maybe the baby doesn't want to run. It's not ethical. Maybe some groups are doing it. We'll see.
Or some nations.
Some nations are doing it.
We'll see come the next Olympics.
Do you know what? We are behind a lot of the exercise doping. The stuff they're doing in some cases is so much more advanced to what we're doing in the laboratory. And we find out years later we'll do some big breakthrough and, they were doing that for years they were just growing muscle cells and implanting them for years, no worries. So that does happen a lot. There's a lot of government funding in some cases, and there's hopefully less now, but there's whole countries that were putting money into athletic performance, a lot more than into science research in some cases.
Wow.
And really augmenting this science under closed doors and helping humans perform better legally. But some of the stuff that they're doing and they continue to do is well above what we can do. It harms the person in a lot of cases, so it's that you could never do it in science research, but you can do it for someone who really wants to reach the top. So sometimes that doping is so much far ahead of, not the doping, but the science around cheating in sport can become so much far ahead of what we're doing in the laboratories. And how do you test for it if you don't know it exists?
Wow.
And this is why the government-sponsored doping programs is such a worry. And it's great that they're banning whole countries and they're picking up these cultures of cheating in sport, because it's otherwise, once you know what's going on, there's a huge amount of money there and research and volunteers that are happy to be trialed on certain things that we just couldn't do in a conventional ethical laboratory.
You're listening to Dr. Christian Moro, Assistant Professor, Biomedical Sciences at Bonn University, on all things physiology and anatomy. Support for today's show comes from the Gold Coast Marathon. Just like the Physical Performance Show, the Gold Coast Marathon encourages runners of all ages and abilities to push their boundaries and strive to complete a personal challenge. The Gold Coast Marathon is held annually on the first weekend in July and is a must-do event for any budding athlete, weekend warrior, or family looking for a challenge to complete together. Run for the good times at the Gold Coast Marathon. Visit goldcoastmarathon.com.au. Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio. We exist to help you get back to your physical best following injury. We do not want to see you for a single session more than what you need to get back to your physical best, and we do this through our unique fixed-fee rehabilitation services, including our award-winning Finish Line programs and also our monthly Wellness Booster packs. To find out more about Pogo Physio's services, jump over to pogophysio.com.au, and there you can schedule your 1-hour initial appointment. For now, let's jump back on this expert edition with Dr. Christian Moro, Assistant Professor, Biomedical Sciences, Bonn University.
The body does seem to be very fatigue adverse. I mentioned before that when we contract our muscle, the brain tries to asynchronous, which means it tries to contract one muscle fiber while the other one's relaxing, and it sort of does them in, not pairs, but this asynchronous contraction. So rather than contract every muscle fiber at once and get full strength, our body would prefer to get half strength and have half the muscles relaxing while the other half are contracting, as a pretty simple example. It's very hard to get. We can do what's called complete tetanus. Our muscle can do complete every single muscle fiber contracting, but that's somewhat of our superhuman strength. You hear of there's a car accident and the father pulls a car off his child. So your muscles can do that. Our muscles can break our bones. They can do things, but they don't usually. So we do have a very fatigue-adverse system. And that's probably better for our survival. Yes, super mouse is better, but it seems like perhaps always having a bit of reserve power and energy, we can run away from that saber-toothed tiger faster, or we can keep fighting for longer. So there's something that's helped us in survival for our bodies to be fatigue resistant. And this is another thing then, when it's you mentioned sort of the psychologies, and then there's a psychology of fatigue, and that I want to slow down and I can't and I shouldn't, and it's hard for me doing things like a VO2 max because I'm not psychologically at exercise. It's very hard to keep going. Yeah, I'm done. No, you're not done. There's heaps to go. Yeah, no, I'm tired. You're not tired. Being in tune with your body to know that you can push yourself beyond limits. And I mean, you guys know that the psychological part of exercise is a whole different thing. And that's where, I mean, maybe that brain hacking can help. So you can say, look, yeah, I'm tired. You're not tired. I can see you just thinking that. You're not actually tired. So are there ways that we can help people psychologically push that fatigue? Because your brain wants to keep your little bit, you want to keep a bit of energy reserve. Your muscles want to keep a bit of energy reserve. And this is where things like the Olympic weightlifters are fascinating, because they have this ability in very short bursts to get just the right sort of length tension relationship in their muscle, just the right overlap between the filaments, but then the exact sort of maximal contraction possible from the human body. And that takes years to practice. To know how to tell your muscles to give you max contraction for a very short amount of time, it's possible, but it's years of practice.
And this just makes me think of Christian, a former guest, Alex Hutchinson, author of best-selling book Endure, which looked at the role of the mind in performance. And he shares this beautiful story of one of the Olympic Games where the South African marathoner ran in silver in second place, just behind the gold medalists. So they were having a bit of a duel at the last lap of the track to win the Olympic marathon. And if ever there was an occasion where two athletes were going to empty the tank, it was running for that gold medal for the Olympic marathon. They both cross the line, have a moment of, wow, it's done. They both pick up their respective national flags and they run another lap. So there is more.
There is more.
And the science seems to be on effort, on physical performance, is it's all the perception of effort. And there is so many factors that can manipulate the perception of the effort. And that's sort of fitting with what you're describing around this fatigue-resistant body.
It's unnatural to use up all your energy. Your body doesn't want to do it. You're fatigue adverse, which means then for you, you've got to push against the natural aims of the human body, which is to keep energy stored in case you need it. And so it's, your mind and your body need to be aware that, okay, I'm going to rest after this. I can reduce, I'm in a safe area. And so there is that huge amount of mentality to fatigue your body, which is needed. And that's a fascinating research area as well in how that happens. But that's, the years of training in that, in not just training your muscles, but also training your mind and training yourself to understand that, I can push through this and do something unnatural in a fatigue-resistant body that doesn't want to burn out and that doesn't want to go super fast that extra mile, just in case. So,
Christian, let's go to the fluids and specifically blood and red blood cells, oxygen molecules. What role do these play in exercise and performance?
So our blood system is beautiful in the fact that, so let's look here. A red blood cell is full of hemoglobin. So as our red blood cells are developing, they look like normal cells. They've got a nucleus, and then in the bone marrow, just before they come out, they kick out their nucleus and they get released as this sort of cell. Because it hasn't got a nucleus, our red blood cells are very poor at regenerating themselves. So they're all destined to die. A nucleus is where we make our proteins a lot of the time, or it has our code for making our proteins, which means that the red blood cells, they last about 120 days, but they are on the way out. And they're beautifully designed. There's two things. Because they have no nucleus, they have this sort of biconcave shape where they maximize surface area. So they're sort of like a semi-donut without the hole in the middle. So there's a little dip, and so where the nucleus used to be, there's this dip. And it does two things. It increases surface area, but not having a nucleus also makes them relatively immune to viruses. You see, a virus needs to enter a cell in your body, and then it enters into, and it gets the nucleus and sort of hijacks the machinery of your body to make itself. So the fact that our red blood cells don't have any nucleus means that they're relatively immune to a lot of viruses. They're not a threat to our immune system. Some things, though, because they're not a threat to our immune system doesn't sort of check them that often. It doesn't really have a good way of checking the red blood cells, which means things like malaria can hide in red blood cells for a long time and then pop out at the end and surprise us. It's funny because everything cool that our body does, oh, great, we had this, resistant to virus system, which is the red blood cells. Yet, on the other hand, there's something that just manages to work out how to use that against us, like malaria. This little bug that lives inside the red blood cells for a few weeks and then pops out later. Now look, each red blood cell contains a molecule called hemoglobin. Well, not a molecule, there's about 250 million molecules of hemoglobin in every red blood cell. Each hemoglobin holds 4 molecules of oxygen, which means each red blood cell holds about 1 billion molecules of oxygen. Now this is, so we're not talking about 1 or 2 oxygen molecules per hemoglobin. This is an incredible system which is designed and developed very much around that like specificity, which is binding oxygen, and it even changes shape a little bit. So the hemoglobin will change a little bit of shape in the lungs to bind oxygen, and then as it gets to tissues, it makes it a bit easier to release. And in fact, if you get to fatigue tissues, it'll release oxygen even more readily. So it has a bit of a system where your blood system will release oxygen where it's needed in a greater prevalence than where it's not needed. And it's beautiful in that respect that it can transfer so much oxygen and just in this simple red blood cell hemoglobin system. Now, we know about other things. There's a bit of protection there as well, like in blood typing. So actual blood, what gives us a blood type is that as these red blood cells develop, there's an enzyme that simply just pops on this little protein on the surface of our red blood cells. So if you're an A blood type, we're all normal, everyone's fine, and then all of a sudden, as your red blood cells develop, it pops on an A. Yep. And so you end up being A blood type, or it pops on a B, or it pops on an A and a B, or it doesn't add any surface markers, so you become an O blood type. So it's a relatively simple system. We don't know why we have blood types. Actually, the weirdest thing is not so much if you're type A, as you're born, you'll start to develop a lot of antibodies against B, a B blood type. That's why A and B aren't compatible in a blood transfusion. But the thing is, our bodies will make antibodies against diseases or other things. You'll come in contact with a virus, you'll make antibodies against it in response to it. So the fact that we've never been exposed to B blood, but our body will make antibodies against the B blood system is very strange. So we're fighting something that we've never seen before. If you're B blood type, you'll make antibodies against A. You've never seen A, you've never experienced it, you haven't been exposed to it, but you're making antibodies against it. And it's a very, very, very strange system. There's naturally occurring antibodies, and it's unusual for anything else. So we don't know why we have blood types. There have been, for example, in regions of the world, like bacteria that look very much like B. So we say we're fighting against B blood type. Maybe we're building antibodies against an old common bacteria or an old common pathogen back in the day. But it's something archaic in our systems that we have to deal with every day in transfusions and what blood type we are. And yet it's such a simple system and we don't know why we have it. And it's very hard to find that out. So there's a lot of unknowns in the body, in the blood type. Even then, I mean, we're talking about what could cause fatigue, some basic stuff. Well, we've got some ideas. It could be this, could be this. How about the brain? We don't know much about it, but we're learning. And so it's everything we look at, we get down to the deep level, we get these questions and we just don't know. But it's also part of the beauty. And maybe it's different for different people. We don't know what's going on with the body, but it's a fascinating area to study.
It makes me think of previous guest, expert edition, Dr. David Cunnington, sleep specialist, and we all recognise the importance of sleep. Mm-hmm. There's manyfold benefits to sleep, and yet the question that remains unanswered is, why do we sleep?
Because we feel sleepy. That's been the best way I've been told.
And isn't it, so once again, it's an endless. And Christian, that red blood cell, how does that then translate to respiration and, what's the role with exercise there?
So this is the thing. Now, the more oxygen we can get. So one of the things as well that will cause, we mentioned depletion of ATP. So you want to have that ATP. And so using sort of very endurance, long activities, the more oxygen you can get to that tissue, the better. The less waste it will build up because you've got this aerobic system going on. So we know about erythropoietin. So what will happen if we become hypoxic? So
EPO is everyone
EPO. Everyone calls it EPO?
Yes.
Yep, EPO. So as we become hypoxic, EPO is released from our kidney and our liver. And EPO gets released and it'll increase our red blood cell. So a number of red blood cells. Actually, interesting. Here's something. The female system compared to the male system, the female system has less red blood cells in it, a lower hematocrit, which is called, so a less number of red blood cells per milliliter of blood. Yet there's no difference in tissue oxygenation. So the female system has less red blood cells, but the same amount of oxygen in their tissue. So there's something in the female body which is better adapted or better at getting oxygen out of the blood. So they need less blood, less red blood cells. I don't know what's wrong with us as males. We're not doing that as well. They liken it to, in the past having been iron deficient because of the menstruation cycle and other things. So there's reasons the female system would do that. But it's incredible that we're also similar. But when you look at blood tests, we actually have quite significantly and consistently interestingly, as an average across a group, a far lower amount of red blood cells in the female body, but it makes no difference at all to them. What does higher red blood cells do? And this is where things like, some of the doping to increase EPO or remove red blood cells and then add them back in again. So having more oxygen does help in some sports, which means you can help your muscles can endure for longer without getting fatigued. But there's also a lot of negatives in having a lot of red blood cells. Your migraines, a much thicker system, so it moves around much slower. Get big headaches because your body's trying to squeeze this high amount of red blood cells through the same capillaries. So there's a lot of negatives, and I guess it's one of the things that it's interesting to us that a lot of the athletes that are heavily doping high red blood cells must be getting a lot of negative effects as well. So the body's very good at adapting. So if you go to a high altitude, you'll have erythropoietin release because your tissues will have less oxygen, so you'll make more red blood cells. And it's finding, I guess, that trade-off behind our bodies, where we're happy or where we're healthy, with the number of red blood cells in us. It's interesting because if you inject EPO, highly illegal, very bad. But if you go to an altitude, your body makes the same product, the same amount, that's totally fine. So it's interesting behind, same as growth hormone as well. That a growth hormone in a 17-year-old body is a highly illegal dose in a 40-year-old body, even though our bodies are making these things. And I guess it's the difference between going and doing it yourself and the doping. But it's interesting that our bodies keep this what's called homeostasis. It keeps this very even balance of red blood cells, of salinity, of water, of all this stuff in our body to a level that works well for us. But being a fatigue-resistant system, for some people they find altitude chambers do give that extra bit of oxygen that does help them in their sport, but it's very much an individual thing. So the science out on that is still interesting per sport, but then of course, when does it become doping, or when is it unethical to enhance red blood cells to the way? And that's where we're sort of at now with some of the things that have gone on in sport in the last decade.
You're listening to Dr. Christian Moro on this expert edition around all things anatomy, physiology, and performance. If you missed last week's episode, another expert edition featuring Andrew Hall, sports dietitian for the Brisbane Broncos and Brisbane Bullets, then here's a little snippet of what you missed. To tune into the full episode and explore the archives of the show, be sure to jump over to pogophysio.com.au for the show notes, or peruse the archive from within your favourite podcast player, dating right back to episode 1, featuring surf life-saving Ironman champion Ali Day. For now, let's jump back with Dr. Christian Moro on this, an expert edition of the Physical Performance Show. Christian, every guest of the show issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. Using the knowledge that you have, the extensive knowledge, the insights, would you issue listeners of the show with a physical challenge for the week? Dr. Christian Moro.
Let's use our neuroplasticity. Let's think about if you were to enhance your brain in one area, what would it be? Would it be juggling? Or would it be thought processes? And doing that regularly does actually exercise the brain. People, when you get these brain exercise apps now, it says, do you want to work on memory or critical thinking? And they're actually right. We can exercise certain parts of our brain like any other part of our body. Now, we don't know how that benefits us in the long run, but it's a pretty cool prospect to treat our brain like a muscle. So consider your brain as a muscle. Maybe it will help. And this is where, working through that mental endurance, working through that, not so much the pain thresholds, but preparing your mind and your body for the activity that you're wishing to do. Because it looks like the longer we do it, the more our brain will respond and the better we can become at it. And the earlier you start, the better.
So the challenge would be juggle?
No, we'll juggle if you'd like to change that. But consider your brain as a muscle. And if you're looking to work and go further, let's think about endurance and be in tune with your body and focus on that. So work out your brain as you work out your body.
Beautiful. Christian, one of the interest areas you're working on, it's one you great acclaim in recognising the teaching level that you bring to your profession, but is this virtual and augmented reality. And I've seen you popping around on screen and at different times with these Oculus virtual reality looking headsets, and you can now take students through a molecule journey, if you like, through the body, correct? So just out of interest, can you just give us a very brief update on what you're working on there and what it actually means to education?
So one of the problems in talking about the body is it's 3D. Now, I'm not that good a drawer. And so if I'm trying to draw, for example, the eye and to show that this muscle moves the eye in this direction, it's very tricky and it's very hard. So one of the ways we looked at was out of necessity. Perhaps we can use virtual reality as a way to put a student in this completely enclosed environment and see the body in 3D. So we use technology very much out of necessity to try and explain the body, to show that interrelationships in 3D space, to show where bits connect, where the muscle connects to and how it works in 3D. So technology's been very, I guess it's empowering to us that we can now talk about the body in 3D rather than just me trying to draw a 2D image on the screen. Or remember the old anatomy textbooks, 2D illustrations. They were never as good as they could be, and you didn't really get those 3D structures. So there is a thing, I mean, we're using technology a lot to enhance that in-class experience. There's a real trend in education to move offline. So a thing called MOOCs, where students study from home. And I get the benefit of studying from home. You can sit down with a glass of wine and pajamas and watch a lecture, whereas we still make them come into university and hear one of us speak. But if you've got 60 students for an hour, you can't even give them 1 minute each of time. And so how do we augment and enhance that? And so technology for us has been very good at teaching the body, along with resources like the cadavers and the plastic models and silicon models and textbook illustrations. We also have this ability to get virtual reality and have a 3D heart beating in front of us, or be inside the human skull or inside the body and exploring it from the inside out. And it's a beautiful system that gives us that extra way to just make sure that everyone around that room really understands certain features. And so technology's come to us as a relatively, as a necessity to help certain things. And I mean, looking at a real human brain, for example, the brainstem is very small, but I'd like them to realize where's the pons, where's the medulla oblongata, where's the different areas, and we can, in VR, we can blow up that small part of physiology or anatomy and really look into it on a detailed level. So it's been very, very positive. So that's where the technologies come into the classroom now. And
these students, you'll have a student, a student with the technology on their head, or will it be the students all with these in sync?
No, we very much do it as stations. So there'll be a 6-minute lesson, so only a couple, maybe 4 to 5 students at a time will be in the VR, while the rest are with us with the cadaver or the plastic models or the microscopes. So there's not sort of, a technology lab now is really only 5 minutes on technology because there's so much other stuff to learn. So we use it as a certain mode to augment what we're teaching, to use tablets or VR or AR, to really help with the finite small details that I can't really produce any other way, because the bits in the real human bodies are too small, the models are too small, or I can't draw them. So it's just a way to augment it. So we're not replacing any teaching with technology. People say, oh, you're not using this anymore. Yeah, we still are. We're still doing the same way we've always taught, but we now have this extra tool that for a few minutes in a lesson, you can put on this headset and be inside the body in a very structured sort of lesson. We found that the best. And there are universities doing whole, like computer room, whole setups with these. But for us, we find that very much that, a couple of devices works. And it's one of the things around the world and even in schools. The old school program is to have a computer room where everyone has all these computers lined up, whereas now we're finding putting a few computers in a room does sort of help. Putting a few devices in the room does help us as teachers to get that extra bit of information. It's an extra teaching tool that we can use amongst all the other devices that we have and all the other tools that we have.
Christian, listening to you share just a snippet of your world today, your students are very, very, very well equipped to have you teaching them anatomy and physiology. Extremely lucky students. Your passion's very evident, and obviously also your knowledge. So thank you for popping by to share just a snippet of the fascinating world that you inhabit. Where can we follow your journey more? You've got some great YouTube videos which you work on, and also you're quite active on Instagram, but what are the handles?
Yeah, so Physiology with Christian. So Physiology with Christian on YouTube, which I'm working on. I need more videos out, but I'll do it. So working on that channel, while also Instagram, Physiology with Christian. And that's been actually a nice way to share bits of information and focus on things like awareness days in physiology, World HIV Day, World Radiography Day, World Cancer Day. So there's actually a lot of these ways of, the UN and the WHO trying to promote certain things. And it's great for us then as educators to piggyback on these and help get that message out. So I've found social media a really good way to interact with the community. So YouTube and Instagram.
Dr. Christian Moro, thank you for popping by and featuring on the Physical Performance Show.
Thank you very much.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust you enjoyed today's expert edition featuring Dr. Christian Moro. If you did, please let Christian know. You can find him easily over on Instagram at Physiology with Christian. That's all one word, lowercase, Physiology with Christian. And from there, you'll be able to link out to Dr. Christian Moro's YouTube channel and follow his incredible academic career. I'd love to know what it is that you enjoyed from the show as well, or any feedback you have on how we can make the show better. Perhaps it's a featured guest, performer, coach, or expert edition you'd like to hear either from or more about. I'm at Brad_Beer, and of course, keep the podsies coming at Physical Performance Show over on Instagram. Simply take a screenshot of the episode you're enjoying and tag away. Massive thanks to those leaving reviews over on iTunes. It really does help the show enormously, as does subscribing to the Physical Performance Show. It really is the best way to help the show grow. Massive thanks this week to Woody2511. Woody commented, recently discovered, but may have been listening non-stop since. Brilliant insight into the lifestyles, training, and mindsets of Olympic and world-class athletes. As a swimmer myself, I seriously love the Andrew Lauderston interview. Would be great to hear from a legend like Jeff Hugel on his comeback, or Nick Darcy on his side of the story. 5 stars. Woodsy, thank you for taking the time to leave a review. And as a little thank you, we'll get a copy out to you of my Running Jogging bestseller. You can run pain-free in its second and revised edition. I know you're a swimmer. Perhaps you'll enjoy the book as well. Drop me an email, b.beer@pogophysio.com.au. Another massive thanks to today's show sponsor, the Gold Coast Marathon. It truly is a remarkable event with a distance from everyone, from the junior races right through to the full feature-length marathon. Don't forget to jump over goldcoastmarathon.com.au and select your event, and I'll see you on the beautiful Gold Coast come July. Big thanks to the 3 great folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Matthew Walding on all things show graphic design, and Susan Wilkin on all things show administration. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, I'll bring you a featured performer edition featuring Queensland Reds up-and-coming rugby union sensation James Tuttle. Now, James has quite a remarkable story. He recently ruptured his Achilles tendon, commenced intensive rehabilitation off the back of his surgical repair, only to 5 months later re-rupture the same side 1 centimetre higher than his prior rupture. And I caught up with James 3 weeks after his re-rupture for an insight into the world of the psychology of injury, and of course, the theme of this show, the highs, the lows, and the learnings. So be sure to tune in next week for the Physical Performance Show. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer. This has been the Physical Performance Show.